Today's card is not exactly what I wanted to be reviewing, but it's what fell on my desk and when the RAM for another more interesting video was unfortunately not working. This right here is Nvidia's GTX960. Hardly one of the most exciting cards out there, but one that people often ask me about, but also a card I've never really been keen on since it came out, because I remember when they came out. Released in early 2015, it was Nvidia's response to AMD's R9 and you'd think it'd be alright with 1024 CUDA cores, 2GB of GDDR5 memory, and a decent Maxwell 2 architecture to back it all up. These are the types of specifications you really think would do pretty decent. Supporting DX12 and using just over 100 watts under peak load, it's actually not too bad. But price-wise, it seems to have hit a bit of a brick wall, usually costing as much as a GTX 970 and often more than an RX 470. It's not a cheap card. So what else is going on with it? Well, first of all, I can actually give my perspective on what this card was like back in the day. And from what I can remember, I was actually in the market for a new graphics card in early 2015, when this card had actually just come out to fairly decent reviews. I needed an upgrade from my at the time still decent HD 7770, giving me two real options: AMD's Tonga-based R9 or this here GTX 960. At the time, they duked it out fairly closely, with Nvidia often doing better in titles like GTA 5 by a few FPS, and AMD edging it closer in things like Battlefield. Really close performance between the two. The issue is, AMD's card wasn't a GTX 960 competitor. No, it went up against the previous generation's GTX 760. So the fact it was able to hold its own against Nvidia's newer generation card, the 960, well, it made it a bit of a no-brainer. I bought the AMD card, it was cheaper, and in most of what I needed it to do, it performed better. Today though, as it stands, the AMD card has pulled ahead dramatically. Thanks to DX12, Vulkan, better memory compression, well, it's doing way better than Nvidia's lukewarm mid-range release. So here we are in 2020 with the GTX 960 sort of flopping around in mid-range limbo. Its competitors have long since dropped in price, despite outperforming it. Newer cars that are a tier higher are often found cheaper, in either refurbished or new condition, but let's say for a moment you managed to find a GTX 960 at a rare good price, and you wanted to know how it performs. Or perhaps this video might crash the market and make them actually good value. Either way, let's find out how they're holding up in 2020. Starting off with Red Dead Redemption 2 really does begin to show the limits of the card already. With a hard limit on VRAM, it took a while to even find different settings that would actually work. Even changing resolution on this card was a bit of a chore given that VRAM limit. However, once we found a nice balance of settings that did work, providing us use of the low, medium and high settings, the game did look nice, and it ran pretty stable as well. It's just you'll struggle to see much better performance than this at higher or lower resolutions. When utilising the medium preset in Mountain Blade Bannerlord, we saw fairly decent settings, albeit a slightly fluctuating frame rate, but this was about as good as it was going to get. Still, we did see 1080p as a resolution, and the game did run pretty smooth. But compared to its contemporary competitors, I know that they're holding up a bit better than this. Maybe the 4GB VRAM on the larger and even more expensive GTX 960 could be a bit more helpful here, but still a 2020 title running this well on a 5-year-old card in full HD is definitely more than passable. BeamNG really did run well, and I'll definitely give some praise to the card for that. Using the medium preset in full HD, the game does often favour Nvidia hardware, and in this case there's no change to the norm. Even then though, with the most intensive maps, we saw rarely any frame rate beneath 60 FPS, and in this instance I'm quite impressed with the GTX 960, it runs games like this really well. It's just a shame the card costs so much. New titles like the MasterChef collection will run at a constant 60 FPS. Although the game didn't seem too keen on actually running at higher settings, it would really bug out for some reason, I'm not too sure why. I did try different drivers, but still, didn't seem to want to try any higher settings than that. I opted for a full HD resolution, and to keep things standard, well, the game ran really nicely. I'd imagine you could probably run some higher resolutions, definitely up to 1440p, and I was able to launch the game with no issues at all, as long as I used these settings. I've experienced some problems running this game on AMD hardware, with the game usually throwing up a few errors, so it was nice to be able to launch this game without a problem. CSGO is another instance where the card is doing exceptionally great. With a mixture of low and high competitive settings in the full HD resolution, we saw the game run above 250 FPS virtually all of the time. Only the most intensive smoke would bring this card down to a crawl. Unfortunately, the GTX 960 isn't exactly above the Source Engine smoke slowdowns. More than decent enough for competitive CSGO, but there's still better options in this type of price range. GTA 5 is a game that people often tell me is getting harder to run. Well, no it's not, because it's running about as well as it did 5 years ago with this card. With predominantly high and ultra settings being used, the game stuck around the 60 FPS mark all of the time. You couldn't really push much higher than this in 1080p, but that's all this card was ever really designed for. It wasn't exactly designed to be pushing higher resolutions than that. Still, not bad at all, and performance like this can be expected from any titles from around the card's release date. It did do well when it came out. To reiterate this point though, we have Skyrim Special Edition running with the high preset, with the game sticking pretty much bang on the 60 FPS mark. Honestly, I don't often get time to check out this game all too often, and I can say that on this card it really does look lovely. Ultra is of course a bit too much for the card to handle, but as long as you don't mind using those high settings, well, you'll be more than happy with what you're seeing on screen. The gaming performance, well, honestly it's pretty decent, but it does show where the cracks are beginning to form. Although 2GB of VRAM is still just about enough for 1080p gaming in the latest releases, a few people have found AMD's memory compression does allow for equivalent Tonga cards, which are about the similar age, to run a bit better on those demanding titles. I know I've managed to get Red Dead 2 running far nicer on my old R9 285, but the GTX 960 just can't seem to manage those types of settings. The thing is, I'd probably forgive all this nitpicking, as this is honestly some really rather decent performance for a half a decade old card. But when I keep seeing these things sell for upwards of the £70 mark virtually all of the time, I just can't justify it. However, it does have some pretty decent NVENC support, so I'll throw up those results here. So, compared to AMD's VCE that we saw on my last video on the AMD Fury, this is one area where the card is pretty decent. I'll be honest, NVENC just took massive leaps around this time, and AMD VCE just stagnated. Synthetically as well, in 3D Mark, the card also performs pretty well, but also goes to show that it's really far too weak for any remotely modern and decent CPU, as they can still handle far better graphics cards, but gives you an idea of what type of performance this little card can compare to. Now though, we've reached the conclusion point of the video, and I hope you're all sat down for a bit of a small rant here. The performance, well, it's more than good in my books. The feature set, well, it's still decent. Even drivers are up to date and give plenty of in-game support. But here comes the negativity towards these cards. The price. It's been frozen for what feels like a couple of years now, with a lot of these cards still selling on namesake alone. That is of course the Nvidia GTX name. Going through eBay, it seems like most 2GB models sell for around £70 to £90, with £80 being the buy it now price, and the 4GB variants hit around £100 quite often, and a lot of those are going on auction. So if you want to buy it now, they go for about £120, and people are actually competing to buy these, despite the fact that the GTX 970 costs the same or less, or an equivalent RX card with the same performance as the bloody aforementioned GTX 970 also costs less. I know that they can be bought straight out of China for about £70 to £80. In fact, I aim to get hold of one to review one. I don't think the GTX 960 is a bad card. but considering its competitors now sell for sub £50 for an R9 285, and that one actually serves their budget audience much better, I'm just not all too impressed with this GTX 960. People keep telling me that it could be a good budget card, but I can't see any regions or territories where it is, because it just sells for so much everywhere. It's a mid-range card that served its purpose for a couple of years and is better off forgotten unless the price halves itself overnight. So I hope you've enjoyed watching this. Please don't buy this card, at least not for its current price, and good night. So I hope this clears up my opinions on the GTX 960. If you want to see more like this, you can always like and subscribe for more, or for $1 a month over on Patreon, I make other videos which are more like just lengthy me talking to the camera videos about whatever it is I bought. So catch you then, fellas.